Good evening and welcome to Q&A. Live, as you can hear, from Studio 31 in Melbourne, I'm Tony Jones, here to answer your questions. The foreign editor of The Australian, Greg Sheridan, whose latest book is A Defence of Christianity, God is Good for You. Author and academic Randa Abdel-Fattah. Labor member for Franklin and Shadow Minister for Regional Development, Julie Collins. Victorian Liberal Senator Jane Hume, and philosopher and author of Animal Liberation and The Most Good You Can Do, Peter Singer. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Now, Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio, but not unlike the Royal Wedding on News 24. Well, our first question tonight comes from Leon Steinkoller.
Hi, Tony. Whilst walking the other day, I came across a poster on a lamp pole promoting a GoFundMe site designed to help the person pay a $15,000 veterinarian bill incurred saving the life of their beloved pooch. The poster was complete with a confronting photo of the dog in the middle of surgery. Whose responsibility is this massive bill? And can Peter Singer and the panel help me decide whether or not to donate?
Peter, we'll start you off in a light-hearted vein.
I think you can probably find better uses for the money than to pay a veterinary bill of that size, I have to say. I don't think that we put the same value, or we really ought to put exactly the same value on the lives of non-human animals as we do on human lives, because for dogs, they're not thinking about their future, they're not planning ahead, they don't have something to lose in quite the same sense. So sometimes, actually, you know, a lot of veterinary care for an animal may be causing more suffering than the good that it does.
I'll just remind you of what you said in 1975. All the arguments to prove man's superiority cannot shatter this hard fact: in suffering, animals are equals. Should there not be some form of Medicare for these dogs?
Absolutely. In terms of pain relief, and I hope we'll be getting onto that with other animals on this program, but in terms of suffering, we should regard that as just as bad. If there are similar quantities of suffering, whether they're dogs or sheep or whatever they might be, I think we should regard that as just as bad as if there's suffering to a child, for example.
So your argument to this gentleman is not to help fund the operation of this pooch?
That's right. I think there are less expensive ways of reducing suffering if that's what's going on. And in terms of lives, there are many. You can actually save several human lives with $12,000, so I wouldn't put it all to one dog.
Jane Hume.
Well, the Liberal Party is all about freedom, choice and personal responsibility. If you want to go and fund a dog's operation, go for your life. That's your business.
And I suppose as a Liberal you'd say, why the hell didn't they get health insurance?
Pet insurance, that's a whole nother topic. Let's not go there.
Judy.
It depends on the circumstances, I guess. It's a lot of money for a vet bill. I'd be really surprised if I ever had a vet bill that high. I have pets. I've never had a vet bill that high, and my pets have had some serious accidents and incidences. So I'd be really surprised. It would depend on the circumstances of the person, I guess, who's put the GoFundMe up. I'd be reading a bit more into it. But
You're not
it's up to the individual.
some kind of scam going on here,
Oh, no. I mean, you know, it might be, you know, an old lady it's her last companion and the dog's fine and the operation went well. She simply can't afford the bill. I mean, it depends on what the background story is.
Greg.
Well, I don't agree with Peter that the moral consequence of an animal's suffering is as great as a human suffering. And Peter wrote in 1976, in fact, that there would be many animals who would have a greater claim to rights than some categories of human beings, profoundly retarded babies or very
Wouldn't
old
have been
people.
rights, Greg. Wouldn't have been rights. I'm a utilitarian. I wouldn't have talked about rights.
But you'll know the quote that I'm familiar with. There are,
I don't.
Well, in fact, you said, I think I can give you the words exactly. It was something like, there are many animals whose lives have more value than human beings, such as, you know, severely handicapped babies or very old people in dementia. Now, I admire Peter's writing, and I admire the clarity and logic with which he addresses these subjects, and he's a very helpful writer because he takes you to the logical conclusion of many of our current assumptions. But I think it is grievously anti-human and an assault on human dignity to equate a human life to an animal life. And there is no context at all in which I would think that an animal life is more valuable or has more potential than a human life at any stage, whether that's a profoundly handicapped child or a very elderly person.
So even if
dementia.
the animal is clearly more intelligent, more aware of its environment because of the very profound brain damage that the human has suffered, you still think just the fact that the human is a member of our species means that their life is more valuable or has some special dignity?
Yes, I do, absolutely, Peter. I think human dignity is uncompromisable, and if you start an assault on the distinctiveness and universality of human nature, you end up in a very dark and terrible place indeed. And just the quality of a human being a human being, in my view, generates dignity, which we have to take account of, which is not generated by an animal.
I'm going to just interrupt because Randa hasn't come in here yet. I think we might have to bring you in on the serious end of the discussion. So do you think an animal's life could ever have the same value as a human life?
No, I don't. But that doesn't mean that I don't believe animals should be treated humanely and ethically. I also think this is a topic without in any way at all trying to say that we should abuse animals or mistreat them. But it is a topic in a first world country. It's a topic of privileged people. The fact that there are people who have $12,000 bills for their children. The fact that there are people who have $12,000 medical bills that they can't pay. But we're talking about a $12,000 vet bill. I'm not trying to say that I don't believe that pets should be treated well and that we should treat them with compassion. But I do think this is a conversation that it doesn't speak to everybody in the audience or in the community, and there would be people who would say that we spend a lot of time thinking about how we treat animals. What about people who we lock up in detention, refugees? Again, it's not about trying to equate one, trying to mount a what about these people argument or what about this cause. But there is a fundamental problem if we are going to focus a lot of attention on the ethics and care of animals and we treat human beings as animals.
Let's go broader, and we've got a question from Samir Sharma.
There is rising monarchism in Australia, especially amongst young people. Is this just celebrity escapism from an increasingly pessimistic and hopeless generation? Or is there something distinct about young people that gives them a fondness for an elite British ruling class?
Greg Sheridan, I think I'll start with you on that one.
Well, look, Tony, I once before declared on the ABC I'm a lifelong Irish Republican with an inbuilt hostility to the British monarchy, who has become a constitutional monarchist. I'm a Republican for a constitutional monarchy. That royal wedding was genius PR by the British royal family. I'm sure Harry loves Meghan and Meghan loves Harry, but this was a strategic marriage on a par with William of Orange and Mary of England. It makes the monarchy multicultural. It makes them hip. Suddenly, people of colour can identify with the royal family. It also, well, a lot of them have said they can. It also means that an institution which used to be very monocultural is now more diverse. But it also serves one serious political purpose. It is a non-controversial element in our political structure. Now, Harry has had episodes where he's been drunk, he's worn Nazi uniforms, he's done other things I wouldn't mention. And if a politician had done any of that, he would be torn limb from limb. But the Brits, whose political debate is even more caterwauling and hostile than ours, all had to sit up and say, God bless Harry, he's our son and we love him. And that, in a way, reassures the Brits. I mean, if there's ever a crisis, the armed forces aren't loyal to the Prime Minister, they're loyal to the Queen. This sits above politics and it's very effective.
Greg, you used to be a Republican, and so I'll just take you to the question is asking really about the incredible number of young people who tuned in. 2.5 million Australians watched that royal wedding, and so my question to you is, does that depress you or please you?
Look, I was forced to watch it in my house. There was a Democratic vote and I was outvoted. It was on the TV whether I wanted it or not. What a Grinch you'd have to be if you didn't feel well for Harry and Meghan and all their close personal friends. Oprah Winfrey, George Clooney, people they've known all their lives, good on them. They're good at this PR stuff. And it's a success. It's a grey old world. May is miserable. Corbyn is frightening. Harry and Meghan, God bless them.
Randa.
Look, I'm not above, enjoying Hollywood celebrity gossip and stories, but for me, the monarchy represents an institution of imperialism and racism, and it has been enriched by that, by corruption, by imperialism, racism, slavery. And for me, it's not just that suddenly we have a biracial bride, and so suddenly that kind of diversity politics erases the history of that institution. So for me, we need to be critical, and I think we shouldn't lose our critical eye when we look at these things and not be seduced by the pomp and ceremony, and actually recognise what this institution stands for. The fact that homeless people were taken away from the streets, the fact that the Grenfell massacre, Grenfell fire, people have still not been compensated. These are the real issues here, not what Megan was wearing and whether or not she's now reformed an institution that is fundamentally sick at its core.
Now, Jane, you're a monarchist. You're a monarchist, so I'm intrigued as to what your feeling is about young Australians tuning in such large numbers to watch the royal wedding, and whether you actually think this is a good thing.
I hope I'm counted as a young Australian. I don't think I am, sadly. Although in the Liberal Party I'm counted as young. That's always a good thing. Look, yes, I am a lifelong monarchist and a very proud one at that. I've got to say my concern was that this was potentially turning into a bit of a circus, the Markle debacle thing. But I was really proud and had a little tear in my eye, I think, along with most Australians on Saturday night. I must admit I was watching it in the football at the same time. But I thought it was terrific, and I love the fact that Harry and Meghan do tend to bring a more contemporary edge to the monarchy and make it more relevant for young people. I think there's nothing bad about this at all.
How is it relevant?
Well, I think that it just makes people they feel more accessible, they feel more approachable, they feel more responsible. I think that they take their humanitarian work very seriously. I think it's a terrific addition to the monarchy.
Does it kill off or help kill off the idea of having a republic in Australia?
No, I don't think so. I think that it's an entirely separate issue. In fact, that there were an awful lot of Republicans watching the wedding on Saturday night, and they too had a tear in their eye. They were just very happy for a young
Probably
couple
for different reasons. Julie.
I think you could have enjoyed the royal wedding without, being a monarchist.
Did you? Did you actually
I was
watch
flicking channels, yes, I was flicking some channels.
It was on every channel, so...
Well, there was some other things on. There was football on. But, I'm a staunch Republican. I believe Australia is a free and independent country and we should have our own head of state. I've always believed that. The royal wedding hasn't changed my mind, and I don't think it'll change many other Australians' minds.
What about the shifting of the minds of young people, as the questioner has suggested?
I don't think it will change the minds of young people. I mean, we heard, the cheer from the young people in the audience here earlier when people said, we don't think it will change people's minds. They're not really relevant to Australia anymore. I mean, yes, it was a lovely wedding. Yes, they're clearly in love. My favourite bit was the bishop talking about slavery and gestating. I'm sure some people really enjoyed that. And it was good fun and lighthearted. But I don't think that it's about whether or not, we're a Republican or a monarchist, whether we enjoyed the wedding or not.
Peter Singer, I'm going to guess that you didn't watch it, but I could be wrong. I could be wrong.
No, you're absolutely right. I haven't watched any of it.
But any thoughts about whether republicanism goes off the agenda when 2.5 million Australians follow this so closely?
I think republicanism goes off the agenda when the former head of the Australian Republican movement becomes a Liberal Prime Minister and doesn't show any interest in pursuing the country.
Good call.
Do you want to comment on that, Jane? Because it is an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? I mean, he did lead the entire referendum debate.
He did.
And it seems to be not a big issue anymore.
He's still a committed Republican, but that's not necessarily first thing on the agenda for the coalition government right now.
Well, remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, that is not one of them. Let us know on Twitter. Keep an eye on the RMIT, ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the details. The next question comes from Sarah Ador-Loy.
As a young adult living in Tarneit, in Melbourne's fast-growing western suburbs, it seems that life is a constant struggle. The trains are full and the roads are gridlocked, and population is set to double in less than 14 years. We have to deal with the growing numbers of disengaged youth and families, many having sought asylum, who are continually struggling to make ends meet to feed their children. The schools lack basic facilities such as a usable sports oval. How bad does it need to get before we have a sensible, bipartisan, interlevel government discussion and action? And is it ethical to keep growing the region's population without first addressing these basic requirements?
Hey, Randa, I'm going to start with you because you grew up in Western Melbourne. Thank you for your question. We might come back to you if you're interested in making another comment.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I went to school in Coburg in Melbourne, and I live in Western Sydney now. And also as a writer, I go and visit schools and I speak a lot with young people. It's my area of research as well. And it concerns me so much about how there are certain places in our cities which are entrenched in poverty and marginalisation, but only seem to be relevant to politicians at election time. And I think it really reflects the way that we do politics in this country, which is just focusing on short-term policies and not actually investing and nurturing communities, not investing in communities based on their needs. And if we don't do that for young people, if we don't give them hope, if we don't give them infrastructure, if we don't give them accessible, affordable public transport. I go and visit schools, and I go to the rich schools in the suburbs where there are swimming pools and tennis courts in those schools. It looks like Hogwarts College, for goodness sakes. And then I go to schools where that we are in demountable classrooms and the teachers are apologising because the air conditioning isn't working. And the students are just as committed to a future, to their destinies, but there is one school which is neglected and another which gives them votes, politicians' votes. So I think we need to really hold politicians to account and ask them, where are you when it's not election time? And I hope I'm not saying that rhetorically. I really do believe that we need to invest in young people, and we cannot constantly treat young people as a problem, as disaffected youth who are potentially going to be radicalised by their disengagement. No, they deserve a future in and of themselves because they have the right to have a future and they have the right to be protected and nurtured, and we need to listen to their voices as well.
Let me, in order to do that, thanks, guys. Just give us a second. We're going to go back to Sarah. The idea of listening to your voices is important. Do you feel in some way that your own school is being left behind, that the people that you are at school with are being left behind in some way?
Yes, I feel like if we received more funding and if we were given better facilities, then we wouldn't be as left behind, and I would feel like our voice would be heard and the constant facilities that are needed would be given to us.
Yeah, Greg, let me bring you in here, and I want to hear from the non-politicians first.
Well, I must say, like Randa, I grew up in a very hard-scrabble part of Sydney, in a suburb called Lewisham, and we lived in a second-storey flat, and there were 60 or 70 kids in each class. Education today is infinitely better funded than it was then, right across the board. And some new schools that I'm familiar with in the north of Melbourne, north of Craigieburn, are lavishly funded. So I agree with the part of your question, though, which is that, in general, governments have not kept up with infrastructure in the newly rapidly growing parts of Melbourne and Sydney. I'm in favour of immigration. I'm very glad you're here. I'm very glad everyone here in this room is here. I think the world needs more Australians, not fewer Australians. But to have some acceptance for that, you've got to put the infrastructure in critically: transport, roads, decent housing, and government, state and federal, have not kept up with that.
Greg, do you think there should be a break on immigration until all of that infrastructure is put in place? Because you hear this story repeated in every major city in the country.
No, Tony, I don't. I'm in favour of a big immigration program for this country. We need it. We need it for national security, which I argue about in my columns from time to time. We're a better country because of it. We're a rich country and we should share our riches, and the best way to do that is to welcome more people into our country. And we don't have a particularly big immigration program now. In the 1950s, it was much bigger as a proportion of our population than it is now. But the politicians have got to govern. We've had a crisis of governance in this country, at least since the global financial crisis. And we've been just slow as a wet week on infrastructure. And if you give the politicians an excuse by saying, well, we'll suspend immigration, that'll give them even more excuse not to do infrastructure.
All right. Peter, can I bring you in? And there's this weird thing that's going on throughout the world where let's say the cultural, social and economic elites are gravitating to the centre of all our major cities, and gradually the people who used to live there are being pushed out. It's happened over a period of decades, but it's now reached a kind of critical point.
Yes, it has, and I think some of these outer areas are being neglected, and I really agree with Greg about that, and I agree with Sarah that we do need to have better infrastructure in these areas. The one thing that hasn't been said is that the politicians, instead of raising the money to do that, are talking about tax cuts. And I agree. I think the Greens have said they're not supporting tax cuts because they think we need more infrastructure. And I think that's absolutely right at this stage, that we're not so burdened by taxes. And I think we need to raise the money and use it for the benefit of people in areas that don't have proper infrastructure.
Jane.
Well, this government has actually already committed to $75 billion worth of infrastructure just in the most recent budget. So I reject a criticism there. I think we can, in fact, do both. We can invest in infrastructure as well as providing tax cuts and guaranteeing other essential services as well.
Do you accept the critique that simply hasn't happened in a lot of parts of Melbourne, a lot of parts of Sydney and other places?
Particularly Melbourne. I think that there has been a failure of successive governments in investing in infrastructure. You're absolutely right. And particularly in Melbourne, where we are growing by 250,000 people a year. I mean, that's an enormous amount. One of our great failures is we haven't managed to decentralise those new populations. I'm quite sympathetic to the argument that we should lower our immigration rates, but I think you have to be very careful about that argument. It is quite nuanced. What part of our immigration intake do you want to cut back? Is it skilled migration? I don't think so. We need skilled migration. We don't want to cut back on a humanitarian intake. There's no appetite for that. Do we want to cut back on international students? I think we'd have to change our entire university funding model. Do we want to cut back on family reunions? Everyone's very uncomfortable about that too. So it's not just a matter of the whole number of immigration. It's where those cuts take place. I think would be far better to be more targeted about how our population is dispersed and where the jobs are, where the homes are built, where the schools are built, where we encourage our population to move.
How would you do that, Jane? I mean, people are obviously attracted, like moths to the flame, to cities. Mm-hmm. Would you think of perhaps doing tax incentives for people to, like lower levels of income tax, for example, if you're prepared to live in a regional part?
Well, that's a big call, Tony. But I think that, to some extent, if you build it, they will come. If there is good job opportunities.
They do this in other countries.
That's true. If there are good opportunities in places like, a Ballarat or a Bendigo or a Wangaratta or a Wodonga, one of these, growing cities, Geelong's a perfect example. It's growing at, very rapid rates now because the jobs are there, because the infrastructure's there, because the schools are there. So there is opportunities, I think.
Julie.
Well, it's extraordinary to sit here and listen to a Liberal government say that, they've been investing in infrastructure. I mean, Victoria's been shortchanged for the last 5 years when it comes to federal government infrastructure as a proportion of its population.
But not this
It hasn't received what it should have been receiving for the last 5 years. I mean, and when you want to talk about schools and infrastructure, I mean, we do have a plan for tax cuts and to invest in schools. We want to spend an extra $17 billion on schools in Australia. That's $17 billion that we can afford because we're not giving $17 billion in tax cuts to the big four banks. We are making a choice here about the priorities. Do we want to give corporate Australia a big tax cut, or do we want to spend it on schools and health? We want to spend it on schools and health. And we can do the tax cut for individuals, but we're not going to do the large corporate tax cut because we're making a choice about our values in the Labor Party.
It's the tax cuts that allow... It's the corporate tax cuts that encourage companies to reinvest back into their business and to employ more people, and that's how we can ensure that those communities thrive.
That doesn't work. It's not working anywhere else.
OK, I think we'll leave that one there. We have discussed tax cuts a lot on this program. We'll do it, no doubt, into the future as we find out whether any of them are going to get through the Senate. You're watching Q&A. Let's move on to a different subject. Our next question is from Jodie Henry.
Jane Prentice has lost her pre-selection and now Anne Sidmalis, Lucy Kajui and Jane Hume are in the firing line. As an organisation, the Liberal Party seem to have more in common with the Catholic Church than they do with the Australians they represent. Does the Liberal Party have a problem?
Church, don't you think?
Does the Liberal Party have a problem with female candidates?
Again, I'll go to the journalist on the panel. Greg?
Well, look, I think the Liberal Party suffers from not looking like the community. I mean, I myself I put my hand up and say I'm a moderate conservative, so I'm a bit allergic to quotas, but
does the church suffer in the same way, by the way? Well, the Catholic Church in particular?
Difficult comparison to make there, difficult comparison. I mean, there are only three institutions I really love, Tony. The Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs, News Corporation and the Catholic Church. And they've all had their problems. You know, let's face it, they've all had their problems.
Well, they're all dominated by men, so that's probably part of it.
There's something in that. But look, to address your question seriously, I think the Liberal Party suffers because too many of its politicians are identikit candidates. They're all 30-something, they're former staffers. I'm not really fussed whether they're men or women, but there are far too few women. Women hold up half the political sky in Australia, and so there should be a lot more of them in the Liberal Party. Asian Australians are about 10% of our population, or maybe a bit more. They're not 10% of the Liberal Party room. They're not 10% of the Labor Party room either. I don't want strict numbers and, you know, intersectional political correctness, but the parties have got to look more like the communities they represent. It was great when Major General Jim Molan became a Liberal senator. He was not a 30-something who'd been a political staffer, and so I wish they were more diverse altogether.
So just a quick one, did the Liberal Party shoot itself in the foot when it allowed Jane Prentice to be knocked off as in the pre-selection in Queensland, and should the Prime Minister have intervened to stop that?
No, I think she's a special case. I'd make 3 comments about her. She seems like a nice person and everything. I'd never heard of her until she lost pre-selection, so I don't think she had an enormous profile. Secondly, she was in this very difficult position of saying she was going to go at the next term. It's very hard for a politician to say, vote for me today, but I'm going to retire in the next. That's always a very hard sell. And she said, I'm going to retire in the interests of the guy who knocked her off. So it's a bad PR look for the Liberals. I think they need a lot more women. Would have been crazy for Turnbull to get involved.
OK, Jane, I'll come to you. And you were, according to the questioner, on the endangered species list.
I hope Jodie doesn't know something that I don't know. Look, does the Liberal Party need more women? Absolutely. Women are underrepresented in the Liberal Party significantly. Is this something that we need to be more reflective of the communities we wish to represent? Is it because we need more diverse perspectives when we develop policy? Absolutely. Do we want to encourage more women to run? Yes, we need the support groups within the party to do that, and we need more role models. Does this round of pre-selections and the round of pre-selection challenges, is it because they're women? No, not at all. This is not a gender issue.
So what is it that's happening here in Victoria, Jane? I mean, is it a factional issue? Because the story is, and it's all around the place, that there's a Conservative push to knock off candidates or sitting members who are not seen to be Conservative in their values or Conservative enough.
Yeah, look, I think that one of the most important things to understand about the Liberal Party is that every state organisation is very different and has its own particular issues. What happens in the LNP in Queensland is entirely different to what happens in New South Wales, and that's entirely different to what's happening in Victoria. We also find that our Liberal Party membership ebbs and flows with the issues of the day. And in Victoria, one of the big issues is the Safe Schools program, which is a program, an anti-bullying program that seemed to have been hijacked by a sort of a socialist agenda that was sexualising children, age-inappropriate materials. Whatever it is that you think about, the Safe Schools program, that has mobilised a lot of people to join the Liberal Party. They are very angry about this program. Matthew Guy, the state opposition leader, has said that he's going to abolish it when he comes in. The federal government no longer funds the program, and that has mobilised an awful lot of people. So it's not necessarily a Conservative push per se, it's just a new group of members that have joined the party to rally around this particular
So are
cause.
you likely to be a target?
Well, I don't think
yourself
so.
of that group, because
I couldn't understand why they would do that.
That's how your name has come up in this context, because Katrina Oketel, who's in the group that you're talking about, wanted to be a senator, and
she was on the Senate ticket behind me in the last election. Yes.
So and so she's not muscling her way forward to become a senator.
I don't think that's really the issue here. And look, let's be frank, Senate pre-selections haven't been called in Victoria. We're about to have a redistribution. A lot of this is speculation and conjecture. I think the real issue here, when you're talking about gender, is whether we should have quotas in the party, and that's what it seems to keep coming back to. In my opinion, no, we shouldn't have quotas. The Liberal Party has always been, it's anathema to the party to have that command and control of a quota system, so I don't think it would go down well with the membership base. We value our democratic processes way too much to be told what to do by
What about
an
a target?
organisation. Targets are fine. Targets.
Is there a target now?
Yeah, there absolutely is a target. I don't know whether we're going to make it. In fact, I think that Nick Greiner came out today and said that we probably won't make it. It's a very difficult thing to reach, a target. But, you know, the other thing too, and that's something that we don't talk about when it comes to quotas, is how it affects the women that are there already. So I know that I am a highly qualified, professionally experienced and very capable woman that can hold my own, whether it be in the party room or in a boardroom or in a pre-selection convention. And I know that the reason I got to where I am is not because of my gender, but in fact it's almost in spite of it. And because of that, I have the respect of my male colleagues. And that's really important in Canberra, very important in Canberra. And any Liberal male worth his salt will admire, respect and endorse his female counterparts.
Okay, a question. I'll let you guys come in a second. Our questioner, Jodie, had a hand up. Go ahead.
I'll just say firstly, the Safe Schools program is an amazing program. Corporate Australia are getting behind, you know, equality by having 50-50 people on boards and all that. So I don't see that there's anything wrong with the quota program to equalise what's going on. And I disagree with you when I think that, yes, you may have got there, you know, through your talent or whatever, but I think that the system does, you know, favour the male politicians over female because of it's entrenched in the system. So I think having quotas will actually help weed that out.
I've worked in the corporate sector all my life. Corporations aren't democracies, you know. There's a hierarchy, whereas the Liberal Party is a democratic organisation.
Jane, do you think it's going to hurt? Do you think it's going to hurt the Liberal Party in the election? The perception that women are on the outer.
I don't think women are necessarily on the outer. I think this is something that is somewhat conflated and confected. Do we want more women? Of course we want more women. We want to encourage more women to run, and I think that's where our responsibility is.
I've got to hear from the other woman on the panel, the other woman politician on the panel, first of all, Julie.
It depends on where you're starting from, I guess, Tony. I start from the position that men and women are born with an equal amount of merit. So if you assume that men and women are born with an equal amount of merit, why don't we have the same number of women in Parliament as men? It's because we have a structural problem. How do you overcome the structural problem? You have to intervene and you have to use an intervention. Now, the Labor Party did this in the mid-1990s. We now have almost 50% women in the Parliament because of it. And it's to do with changing the structure and the views and actually having something to change the entrenched bias that's in the system that people don't even realise is there, and they call it unconscious bias. And it is in the system. I mean, in my home state of Tasmania, we haven't had a woman represent the Liberal Party at the federal level, either the Senate or in the lower house, for years. I mean, the head of the Senate ticket always is Senator Erica Betts. I mean, seriously, I mean, they need to become more relevant to the electorate. I mean, we've had an endorsement in the Braddon by-election, it's another man. We have a vacancy in Tasmania next time where, because of the Jackie Lambie thing, there's actually going to be a number 2 vacancy on the Senate ticket for the Liberal Party. Talking to people in the Liberal Party in Tasmania, are they going to fill that position with a woman?
Yes.
Well, who knows? You know, it seems like Steve Martin's lining up for it. I mean, I don't know what's going on, but they clearly do have an issue and they need to address it if they want to be relevant to the Australian population.
Now, are you currently looking at it as an electoral advantage? It could be an election year.
Well, you know, it could be an election year, and obviously, you know, we've got around 50% women. We've got a number of women in the shadow cabinet. We've got a number of women in the shadow ministry. I mean, we don't have the problem that the government's got. It also influences policy. I mean, last time we were in government, you know, the number of women that were around the table made decisions like paid parental leave. We've made a decision recently to abolish the GST on the tampons. You know, that is because women are at the table making decisions. I don't think that if there was a woman at the table when the original GST was introduced that we would have had it on tampons. And it's taken us a long time.
Well, there were the Democrats at the table. And they were largely women.
It's taken us a long time to actually come up with an alternative revenue source to actually make a decision to do that. And we've made that decision because we think that it's a tax on gender.
Randa.
I think I'm in favour of quotas, and I think it's the way that you frame the issue. If you look at it as there's been quotas and affirmative action in favour of men since Parliament started, then you won't see it as an issue of merit. Then you'll see it as a structural problem that has worked to advance and privilege men's, presence in Parliament. But the second thing is that I'm not really interested in more white women in Parliament, to be honest. So if it's not about intersectionality being about political correctness, it's about taking that structural problem that we just spoke about and actually addressing the actual reality of our multicultural society. And it's another thing is to assume that just because we have women in Parliament that that's going to lead to more humane policies, that it's going to lead to fairer policies, is also, I think, problematic. Men and women are capable of being just and cruel. For me, what's outstanding is when Julia Gillard made her brilliant misogyny speech and on the same day cut benefits to single mums. So people are capable, women are capable of being just as cruel as men. What I think is important is that we look at what is actually happening in Parliament, who reflects the Australian society that we live in, and that we shift the debate away from mainstream white feminism, to be honest, and actually start to think about intersectionality, not as political correctness, but the reality of our society.
So when you say you're in favour of quotas, do you mean not only quotas for gender, but quotas for ethnicity?
Absolutely. Yes.
Could that work?
Yeah, it could. I mean, if anything can work if you're committed to it, but it's the fact that we constantly have these blind spots, this myth of meritocracy. It's a joke. I mean, if we look at the institutions of our society, they are privileged based on the racial organisation of this country, which is at its centre a white centre. So we need to address it if we're going to reflect the reality of our multicultural society.
Peter, is there an issue of practical ethics here? I mean, what is the ethical thing to do?
I think there is an issue of ethics here, and I do think I agree with what Randa said, most of that, and I also think that if you're critical of quotas, I mean, it might be because you're saying, well, this is a merit-based selection procedure and we want merit-based people. But I don't think anybody who really looks at parliamentary selection, pre-selections, really believes that that's on merit, that the best people always get up. So,
exactly right.
If they don't, then I think it's reasonable to say we want something more representative. That could be women, and that could be also broader ethnic groups and diversity that we could have, although it obviously clearly would be harder to get quotas all across the board for that. So I'm not sure that that's the way, but I certainly agree that we should have a parliament that represents the way Australia looks today more.
Let me just throw that back to Jane. You're against quotas, but is that because you know you'd never get it through the men in your party?
No, that's not the reason at all. No, that's not the reason at all. Look, there's a couple of things. First of all, what I dislike most is when merit is used as a synonym for objectivity. It never is. It's not a synonym for objectivity. So I would like to take the word merit out of the argument almost entirely. But more importantly, as a woman, and I don't want to get into the multicultural debate because that's another issue of diversity altogether. But as a woman, as all the women are in here, we are 50% of the population. We're not a minority. And I really dislike being patronised as if I am a minority. We are capable of anything, but we are entitled to nothing. We have to work for what we want. And for women that don't get there, well, the trick is work that little bit harder. Don't get bitter, get better.
But that does suggest it's merit.
No, work harder.
I mean, that does suggest that if you work hard, you'll get
nothing that is worth getting doesn't come without hard work. Doesn't come without hard work.
At the beginning of this program, Sarah asked a question. Do you think that she has just as much chance to get into Parliament as somebody who goes to a private school in Toorak? Does she have the same connections and networks, and does she start at the same time?
Sarah, if you'd like to join the Liberal Party, I will make sure you are well looked after, well mentored, and we'll get you there.
Spoken like a white female politician.
As long as you're still there.
I'll be there.
OK. Just one last thing, because I noticed you mentioned you didn't like to be patronised. And, of course, given the state of affairs for women in the Liberal Party at the moment, do you believe the party itself is being patronising?
No, not at all. I don't think that the party's being patronising in the least. We are all treated equally. It doesn't matter whether we are men or women. No one gets away without being challenged. Malcolm Fraser, when he was Prime Minister, was challenged at pre-selection. It's a democratic right in the Liberal Party, and it's something that we're proud of.
So why did you intervene for people like Ian Goodenough, and it appears that you're going to intervene
didn't
for Anne
intervene on behalf of-
Sudamarlis
no.
rather than Jane Prentice?
There is no
it doesn't
intervention.
seem that
It's
there's any
up to party
process.
members as to how they vote. It's up to party members as to how they vote.
OK, I think we'll leave it there. You're watching Q&A. If you want to continue the discussion, stick around for Q&A Extra or follow our Facebook page and share your comments. Our next question is from Amin Abbas.
Thanks, Tony. Palestinians are often held accountable for crimes committed against them. Last week, the Israeli army killed 60 unarmed protesters, including many women and children, and injured 2,000, all in a single day. The UN Human Rights Council called for an independent investigation in which only 2 countries voted against it, Australia and the US. When will the Australian government stop using the line that Israel has the rights to defend itself? And will it for once call for the Palestinians' human rights to be defended?
Greg Sheridan.
Thanks, Tony, for coming to me first on that question. So, look, this is a very emotional and difficult issue. The death of 60 people is a terrible tragedy, and there's plenty of moral blame to go around. I'd make a couple of points to you. The United Nations Human Rights Council, depends where we want to start in the debate, but the United Nations Human Rights Council has zero credibility. It never investigates its members such as Cuba or China, and it has had more resolutions against Israel than against all other nations on earth put together. Now, even if you are a critic of Israel, you cannot believe that it is responsible for more human rights abuses than all the other nations of the whole earth put together. The North Korean labour camp Gulag, 400,000 dead in Syria, and so on. So as an organisation, it has zero credibility, and therefore I think the Australian government was right to refuse to endorse that investigation. Now, the business of the demonstrations is tremendously contested. We're not going to have time to go through all the detail. If it is the case that the Israelis used unnecessary force, that should be investigated, and I would have faith in the Israeli legal system to investigate it, because it has done so, and it has convicted and sent to jail its own soldiers in the past. However, a few things are important to bear in mind. Hamas, which controls Gaza, is a designated terrorist organisation under Australian law, under European law throughout the states of the European Union, under American
Greg, we're going to
law.
come to a question on Hamas in a moment. So, but just Australia was one of 2 countries, the United States and Australia. Why did Australia choose to side with the United States as one of 2?
Well, I think a number of countries abstained, and in the United Nations, in the similar resolution in the United Nations General Assembly...
But it makes a point when you vote against something. Abstaining is... We don't want to get involved in this argument.
Well, I think we were right to vote against it because it was... the organisation has no credibility. But look, a couple of critical points here. In the United Nations General Assembly, many nations, many like-minded nations to us, abstained from the UN, as we did in the UN General Assembly rule. But look, I just want to continue this thought about Hamas for a second. It's terribly important.
No, come back to it, Greg, because we are going to have a question on that, I promise you. Okay. Randa.
Where do I start? Let's start with why Palestinians are protesting in Hamas, in the Gaza Strip. I think it's important to put this into context. If we are really to make sense of this conflict, they are protesting a brutal siege. They are an open-air prison, the largest concentration camp in the world, as has been described by a prominent Israeli sociologist. They are about 1.8 million people in a size of about 355 square kilometres. That's about 41 kilometres by 10 to 12 kilometres. They have a blockade for the last 11 years. Israel described it as economic warfare, where they were calculating the number of calories that Palestinians could live under just short of starvation. They have a population of 75% under the age of 25. 51% of those are children. 97% of the water is poisonous. It is undrinkable. And why is that? Because Israel denied them a water desalination plant and bombed their water treatment facility in 2008 and 2009 siege. It is an area that is trying to send a message to the world that after 11 years of being besieged, of being traumatised, of having no sense of dignity or hope, and being trapped They're not even allowed to leave. That they're trying to tell the world, wake up. It's been 11 years now. What more do we have to do for you to take notice? And they did it in a non-violent protest. And what were they met with? A nuclear-armed state, drones. They were met with live fire by snipers. They were met with people who the IDF tweeted and then quickly took it down, tweeted that they acted precisely, that they knew exactly where those bullets were landing. And as Lieberman said, he said that every person there at the protest was a Hamas operative. Was Layla Ghandour an 8-month-old baby who died, a Hamas operative? He said that there are no innocent people in Gaza. And this is the dehumanising rhetoric that we get when it comes to the Palestinians, that when they protest against something that we would all protest against, they are considered terrorists and they are blamed for their own murder, as Julie Bishop implied in her tweet, where she put first, before any criticism of Israel, that the Palestinians should exercise restraint. So she is clearly siding there with people who are using expanding bullets on children, on people who are protesting, people who are 700 metres from a perimeter fence. So yes, I'm angry on behalf of Palestinians that it takes us this long for the world to wake up to what's happening to Palestinians under our watch. It's a shame, it is a disgrace that Australia voted against something that doesn't even need an investigation. It's no mystery. It's no mystery what happened. There's live testimony, there's video evidence, there's photographic evidence. We don't need another investigation, and then what's going to happen after that? Nothing.
Greg,
Nothing.
I'm going to bring you in because... OK, thank you very much. Greg, I think that, like some of the audience, you reacted when Randa said it was a non-violent demonstration. I presume that's because there were stone throwers among in the crowd.
Tony, I don't want to say anything which I haven't said, if you know what I mean. So, look, you've got to give me a couple of sentences of context if I'm to answer this. The Israelis withdrew from Gaza in 2005 and they said, make this place work and we'll have a partnership together. They had 6 open points. They thought a lot of people from Gaza would come in and work in Israel. They left behind their agricultural industry and so forth. Now, because of Hamas, which took power and murdered many, many Palestinians.
OK, Greg, I'm going to interrupt you only to go to a question.
You've got to let me give the context.
I promise you.
But that's not
fair. It's not fair to allow all this emotion and then to prevent me from having any...
I'm not preventing you. I'm going to the audience. If you just hang on for 1 second. We've got a question from Josh Gladwin. Go ahead, Josh.
Hi, guys. Cool story, Randa. According to American lawyer and academic Alan Dershowitz, the most recent Hamas provocations, having 40,000 Gazans try and tear down the border fence and enter Israel with Molotov cocktails and other improvised weapons, are part of repeated Hamas tactics that he has called the dead baby strategy. Hamas's goal is to have Israel kill as many Gazans as possible, so that the headlines always begin and often end with the body count. Do you agree?
Oh, poor Israel. We're forcing it to murder us. And look at what Israel, the Palestinians are up against. And I don't even need to make this up. The IDF tweeted a pictorial inventory of Hamas weapons of war. Let me explain what was on that inventory. Arson kites, Molotov cocktails, wire cutters, rope for fence, disabled civilians, children. So that's basically telling us that in the IDF's eyes, these are weapons of war, children, disabled civilians, and they are therefore legitimate targets. So instead of blaming Hamas and blaming Palestinians for being murdered, how about we actually look at the people who are actually shooting people and killing babies? And not just that, what I find so contemptible about this is the dehumanisation of Palestinians. The way that we, in a very racist way, assume that they are puppets and pawns of Hamas. They are human beings with free will.
Human shields.
No, excuse me, not human shields. They have dignity, they have free will, they have agency, and they are not some monolithic mass of Arabs. Each one of them there is there for a purpose, to protect and to defend themselves, and they haven't given up on their right to freedom. And this is what frustrates Israel so much and its apologists, that we are still there This is the circle that Israel cannot square, that it wants to maintain and establish an ethno-racial exclusive Jewish nation, but the Palestinian people are there.
So why does Egypt have a blockade against Gaza?
It's disgraceful. Egypt's
so why not blame Egypt as well?
Egypt, it's disgraceful. You are complicit, but the problem is Israeli occupation and the siege.
OK, now I stopped Greg. That is a question about Hamas. You can talk about Hamas now, but I do want to hear from the other panellists.
Yeah, so very briefly, look, I would honestly urge people to read about this. Very difficult to deal with properly in a few sentences in a TV panel. Let me just give you a few points of context. Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza in 2005 and said, let's make this work together. If you work together, you can have a very prosperous economic future. The situation of life in Gaza is terrible, almost entirely because of the actions of Hamas, which murdered, when it took power, murdered hundreds of other Palestinians, murdered dissidents, threw homosexuals off the rooftop, murdered Fatah and Palestinian Authority people. One of the reasons conditions in Gaza are so bad today is because the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah decided to sanction Hamas in Gaza and stop paying the salaries of Palestinian Authority workers in Gaza,
but
and
this
decided
is just nonsense. Was Hamas behind Operation Protective Edge, in which 2,200 Palestinians in 2014 were killed, in which 6,000 airstrikes, 50,000 artillery shells, 18,000 homes destroyed, 56 medical clinics destroyed, 7 UNRWA schools destroyed, 17 medical clinics. Don't believe me.
OK, I'm sorry. I'm going to interrupt both of you just for a minute. Yes,
you've got to let me finish my
it's a flowing discussion, and we'll come back to you.
But I mean, somehow or other, the TV and the people who hate Israel hate this essential context. They hate the context. Now, Hamas is a terrorist organisation which has murdered many, many, many Palestinians. Don't believe me, just Google the Hamas Charter and you will see it is rank, vicious, foul anti-Semitism. It incites murder. Every time it gets across the border, it kills Israeli civilians. Major General Jim Molan of the Australian Army investigated...
He's on next week and he can talk for himself.
Investigated the Israeli... So let me finish this sentence.
Let the other panellists speak,
let me just finish this sentence. He investigated the Israeli Defence Force in detail and said that it exercises the same moral restraint and the same ethical practice as any Western army would.
OK, thank you. Now, Peter Singer, you've been critical of both Hamas and Israel, so let's hear your...
Exactly. I am critical of both of them, and I think the situation is a tragic one, and it has resulted in the tragedy that we're talking about this time. But clearly there are extremists on both sides. And, you know, there was hope some years ago when Rabin was Prime Minister, for example, but sadly he was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli, and hopes for peace went down. And since then, I think both sides have gone to extremes. Certainly the Israeli government has gone to extremes and has not shown signs of really being interested in negotiating peace or stopping settlements. But on the other hand, you have to say, as far as Hamas is concerned particularly, Greg is right. You know, they are a terrorist organisation. They are firing rockets into Israel. They are openly trying to kill Israelis where they can. And they did reject offers of cooperation back when Israel left Gaza. So that's a tragedy for the people of Gaza, and it's very hard to see a way out.
Let's go to the original question, which was asking about Australia's vote to reject the investigation into an incident which killed a large number of people and wounded thousands. What's your view on that?
Well, I would have liked to see an investigation both into why Israel used live fire and could not find a less lethal way of preventing people from attacking and cutting through the fence, but also why Hamas was inviting people to go to the fence when Israel had made it clear that it was going to use force to prevent people, that there clearly was a risk of live ammunition, of people being killed, and why people would go there with their children and babies actually, you know, is mind-boggling to me. What kind of a person would you have to be? You would say, I'm going to take my baby to this area where there's likely to be firing.
Jane.
The reason why Australia voted against this inquiry was because we believed that it was already being prejudged, that the UN Human Rights Council had already prejudged the outcome, and you could tell that from its language. It didn't include Hamas in any of the terms of reference of that inquiry. It only included Israel. It included not just Gaza, but also Jerusalem and the West Bank, which weren't necessarily involved in this particular incident. In fact, it didn't cite this particular incident at all, and it had an unlimited time period over which it wanted to look at Israeli behaviour. So we felt that it was inappropriate, the way that it had been phrased. Now, Australia has supported these independent inquiries in the past. It's supported an independent inquiry into the use of chemical weapons in Syria. So it wasn't necessarily the idea of an inquiry that was the problem. It was the fact that we felt that they had already come up with an outcome.
OK, we've got someone with their hand up over there. I'm going to get a microphone to you. Just hang on. And for a comment, hopefully. Go ahead.
Quick question.
Okay.
If, to Greg in particular, but to others, if you were a young man in Gaza, what would you do?
Well, look, the quality of life in Gaza desperately needs to be improved. That should be the #1 priority of everybody, and it would be improved if Hamas would cooperate with the Palestinian Authority, if it didn't misuse aid to make attacks on Israel, and so on. But the whole Egypt itself maintains its own blockade with Gaza because Gaza is constantly threading terrorists back and forth into the Sinai. It is a terrible tragedy for the poor innocent people of Gaza that they have such a shocking group of terrorists ruling them.
What would you do if you were there as a young man now?
Try to get Hamas out of government, and the courageous Palestinians who've tried to do that have mostly ended up dead.
OK, Julie, haven't heard from you.
Well, I think the whole deaths recently was a bit of a tragedy, and I think the arguments that we're hearing here tonight at the table show how complex an issue this is. I mean, Labor yesterday called for the government to explain its vote in the UN. We were very concerned that we were one of only 2 countries to actually vote against it. As we've heard, some countries did abstain. The question would be, well, why didn't Australia abstain? Why didn't we talk about perhaps supporting another investigation with a differently worded motion? I mean, we're not in government. We don't know what the negotiations around that were. But clearly, I think both sides, if there was an investigation, would welcome it so that we can actually get to the bottom of what happened. And let's not forget, 60 people died. I mean, it is heartbreaking that this continues to happen. This conflict has been going on for a long time. A 2-state solution is the only solution, and we need to de-escalate things, not keep inflaming them.
Randa, I'll come to you, and you can perhaps answer the question, because I saw you nodding when that gentleman said, what would you do?
I think it's an excellent question, because what would the international community have the Palestinians do? They have tried armed resistance and armed in response to occupation. They have tried peaceful, non-violent resistance in the first and second Intifada, which was brutally shut down. They have tried poetry. A poet last week was imprisoned for her poetry. They try peacefully protesting and they are shot down. So what would you have the Palestinians do? There are countless United Nations resolutions that Israel is clearly violating and flouting. The idea that this conflict is complex is something that people use as a way to sort of to deflect attention from what is really a very clear issue here, which is that you have an illegal occupation. You have Israel, which has made the possibility of a 2-state solution impossible. There is no viable contiguous Palestinian state for the Palestinians because Israel has, in violation of international law, transferred 750,000 illegal settlers into the West Bank, taken 80% of the water aquifers. I've been on the roads that go through the West Bank that are only allowed for settlers, so that settlers never have to meet those pesky Palestinians. They can live in their own little bubble, in their little West Bank colonies. Then you have Israeli Arabs.
Randa, we've got to come to a final question, so I'll get you to sum up quickly.
What would you have the Palestinians do? What broke me about this protest is not that they were resisting Israel. It's not that they were sending a message to Israel. They were sending a message to the world. This is our cage. We're rattling this cage. Help us, because we are besieged and no one is coming to our aid. So that's what, for me, is the message here. Listen to Palestinians. Don't believe Greg. Go and read what you can see. Go on Twitter. You'll see photos. You'll see video testimony and evidence, and that's all you need to make a moral decision.
All right. Thank you very much. We have time for one last question. It's from Catherine Daly.
this is not in response to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and that's important to qualify given the nature of the question. I guess it's in response to the broader question around faith in politics and Greg's recent argument in favour of a resurgence of Christianity. So my question is, as a community in the West, we work longer hours in less secure employment, generally across the board. Our debts are high and our cost of living is ever increasing. As a result of this, we're less connected to our neighbours, our communities and our colleagues. So my question is the issue here a lack of faith, or is this just the shortfall of neoliberalism?
Greg.
Well, look, thanks for that question. I believe that the loss of faith is a tremendous crisis for Western civilisation for two reasons. The first is that human beings are formed in a culture, and a culture without faith will form very, very different human beings. And the second reason is this: the only reason that we understand that human beings are special is because of our inheritance of faith. The most revolutionary pro-human rights statement in the entire ancient world was in the book of Genesis, where it said, God created humanity and he made them in his own image. That was a revolutionary statement for its time, and it endowed all human beings, including women and slaves and foreigners, with a certain inalienable human dignity, which we're in the process of effacing. Now we don't like retarded children, we don't like old people who are demented. Their human dignity needs to be compromised. The other thing is, I don't think we can think rationally without faith. Faith is the most rational approach to life. It best explains the universe, and it is the basis of reason. Why do you believe that your name is an accurate reflection of who you are? It's because your parents told you so. Did you examine the documents? No. You had faith in your parents. This was a rational faith. It was a rational decision that you made, but it was a faith-based decision. And all the intricate skein of civilisation we've built up over 1,000 years will pull apart, in my view, if we lose that faith.
Randa, what does faith mean to you? And are you, to take the questioner's point, do you think this is something to do with our failures in our economic system?
Faith for me is about trying to see the bigger picture. I am a devout Muslim, and faith guides everything that I do in my life. It is what drives me to be passionate about social justice, and it's what drives me to constantly check myself and always check my intentions. Who am I speaking for? What platform am I on, and how am I helping to elevate other people's voices? So for me, faith is what drives me to be a better person, a more moral person. That doesn't mean that I don't believe people without faith can be moral people as well. I think this isn't a debate about whether or not atheism is, destroying society, or whether or not faith is destroying society. I think people are capable of good and bad. Of course, as a Muslim, I believe that I am on the right path, but I also believe that I am living in a pluralist society and that there is space for everybody. Ultimately, all I care about is people's actions and character, and I believe that God will judge us in the end.
Now, Julie, go back to the question, and are the problems we see in today's society, or many of them at least, an issue of lack of faith or the shortfalls of neoliberalism, I think was the way it was put?
Well, I certainly think connectedness is really important for people. There's no doubt that, being part of a community, being part of a neighbourhood, being part of an organisation does bring people together, and it does make people feel good about being and having a sense of community. Whether or not believing in a faith and or the issues that you raised change whether or not people have morals, which was the discussion that was happening. I don't think so. I mean, 40% of my electorate, for instance, don't identify with any religion at all. It's up to Australians to decide what they believe in terms of their religion. I do think that the hours that we work and the casualisation of the workforce is a big issue. It is affecting people's well-being, it's affecting people's ability to structure their lives, it's affecting people's ability to buy a home, to borrow for a car, to do all sorts of normal activities that people do when they build a community. So it is affecting people, absolutely. There's no doubt about the fact that low wage growth is having a big impact in Australia at the moment. I think both sides of politics agree that low wage growth is an issue. We both have different solutions on how to resolve it. But absolutely, that connectedness is really important. Yes, our society has an issue because of it, but on the same hand, it's interesting because volunteering is a big part of being a community, and volunteering appears to be going up. So it's a bit of a conundrum, I suppose, that some people are volunteering more and feeling part of a community, and yet we've got people on the other side who are struggling, to make ends meet day to day, who, can't afford their bills, who, in casualised work, they don't know what their hours are going to be next week, they can't plan it. So I do think that, it is very difficult for some people, and other people have, time to put into the community and volunteering more. So
Jane,
it's a very interesting point.
I'm sorry, I beg your pardon. Jane.
I'll give you a very quick answer, and it will have nothing to do with faith, I don't think. The father of conservatism, Edmund Burke, said that civilised society, its greatest foundation stone was goodwill and good manners. And I find that the loss of good manners in our society is one of our greatest downfalls. It's such a shame. You see the anger on Twitter or the fury that people feel. Where did this politeness go? Where did good manners go? It's amazing how far just a bit of goodwill and good manners will take you.
Peter, I almost came to you after Greg's initial comment because you got a bit of a serving on the way through, I think. The notion that Greg is putting here is without faith you can't have an ethical underpinning, and yet I think you would fundamentally disagree with that.
I very fundamentally disagree with that, and in fact I don't think faith is helpful at all, and we've seen that in the issue we were talking about before, where we have people of different faiths, and it's very hard to get a solution when their faiths clash. I think we want reason and argument and reflection, and we also want compassion and concern for others. And I'm not negative about the direction we're going in. I think we are actually generally more compassionate about minorities of all kinds than we used to be. We are also more concerned about people in other countries. The amount of foreign aid, although Australia is doing very badly, unfortunately, in that, but other countries in the world have done quite well and have learnt more about how to help people in extreme poverty. So rates of infant mortality in the world are actually falling, rates of education and literacy are rising. And we are even expanding our concerns towards non-human animals. And I want to get this in because I'm disappointed we didn't get a chance to discuss the live export trade, which is a real blemish, I think, on Australia's record. And I think we can be more compassionate. We ought to be concerned for suffering wherever we see it. And expanding ethics to take into account all sentient beings, I think, is an important step in direction towards better moral progress.
I think that's all we have time for, I'm sorry to say. Please thank our panel, Greg Sheridan, Randa Abdel-Fattah, Julie Collins, Jane Hume and Peter Singer. Thank you. Now, thank you very much. You can continue the discussion on Q&A Extra on News Radio and Facebook Live, where Tracy Holmes is joined by former Australian diplomat Richard Bronowski. Now, next Monday on Q&A, we've got two new MPs who've been launched into Parliament by the citizenship crisis. Retired military officer Jim Molan, talked about earlier, who's now a Liberal senator, and the former head of the ACTU and member for Batman, Jed Carney. They'll be alongside Tim Fung, the founder, that's Fung, I think, the founder and CEO of gig economy website Airtasker, and outspoken Anglican priest Rod Bauer, whose billboard messages attract both support and outrage. Until next Monday, good night.
It's the forum where you set the agenda. Head to the Q&A website to register for our